Hello and welcome to Lesson 18 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series. And today I'll cover a little bit about key squares and opposition. If we take a look at this position, and let me remove this one pawn here, which just popped up there by accident. Okay, so key squares and opposition, they kind of work together. You use the opposition to try and reach the key squares. So here white would be trying to reach key squares. And what are key squares? Well, they are squares that you want to try and reach with your king that will help you achieve a goal. And in this case, we're trying to promote this pawn. And so black wants to keep white out of the key squares, which in this case it would be for white to try and get his king up in front of his pawn and help escort it up to become a queen. So if we look at this position, with white to move, if we load this game up here, which that's funny, it looks a little different than normal. Anyway, so in this position, it looks like white, let's say tries to move here. Black would just block that move and keep white out of the key squares in front of the white pawn. So I'm not going to name all the key squares in different positions, because then you would just be trying to memorize everything, which, for beginners, you don't want to try and memorize all the key squares in different positions. So you want to just try and get your king in front of your pawn. And if you're defending, you want to keep your opponent's king from getting in front of the pawn and escorting that pawn up to make a queen or whatever you decide to promote it to. So in this position, black has the opposition, which I covered earlier. Basically, when there's an odd number of squares in between a king, in between the two kings, then whoever's turn it is to move would have to give up ground or move to the side. So in this position here, the defending king wants to just stay right in front of white's king. And here white can't make any progress. So what does he do? If he tries to push his pawn forward, black will just step in front of it. And then white has to move over and protect his pawn. And now one thing to remember is to move directly back from this pawn here to d7. So this gives you the option. If white jumps over to c5, then you gain the opposition by going to c7. So like this, and black has the opposition. And if white tries to maneuver back around to the other side, you can jump down here, or you could have gone to d7. But if we continue on, you see white would have to defend the pawn. Once again, you step back. If he comes up on this side, you gain the opposition again, leaving one odd square in between you. And white would have to push his pawn forward to try and make more progress. And you just continue this. You just block. The pawn will move straight back. Whatever side the king tries to move forward on, you just jump in front of the king, gaining the opposition. And you get the picture. White will not be able to make progress because when he pushes this pawn and you jump in front, now white either has to move away from his pawn or move here, and it's a draw by stalemate. So this is what you're trying to achieve when you're defending. and your opponent has the extra pawn, and you keep your opponent's king from moving in front of his pawn. So if we take a look back at the beginning here, if black doesn't do that, so let's say white once again moves to e4, but this time black does something different and lets the white king jump in front. So let's say he moves back. Well, now white can jump in front of his pawn and gain the opposition. And then once he moves here, well, now white could jump over to here, and he was able to march his pawn forward because he's gaining control over key squares in front of this pawn. So if black tries to go here, then we just have something like this. Black will have to give ground because white has the opposition, and now white has gained control of the key squares that lead up to this promotion square here. So black can't do anything. White just moves forward. Now he can't even go down and attack the pawn, and white will just march forward here, and black is forced to retreat, and then white will create a queen. All right, so if I go back here, let's see, we'll set up a different position and just put kings on the board, and I'll talk a little bit about the opposition. So I had a viewer ask about if the two kings are far away from each other, well, how can one ensure that he will have the opposition as they move closer together? And so that's a good question. Some beginners might think, oh, it's just random luck. But there are ways to ensure that you will have the opposition. So if we look at opposition in the simplest form, it's basically, let's see here, two kings directly in front of each other. And whosever turn it is to move, they will have to give up ground. So if it's white's turn to move, then black has the opposition, because white will either have to step backwards or move to the side, and that could let black swing around and move forward here and gain some ground. And then, the opposite, if it's black's turn to move, the same thing. He could step back, but then white gains forward momentum. If he steps to the side, white could try and swing around over to the edge here, and white will gain some ground, and black will have to concede some ground here. But if we look at the different types of opposition, if they have one square directly in front of each other, so this is just a direct opposition. You can also have opposition diagonally. So here, this is the diagonal opposition. So if white is here on e3 and he moves here, he has the diagonal opposition, and black will have to give ground. If he tries to move, here. All right, try that again. So if it's black's turn and white has the diagonal opposition, well then, let's say black tries to move closer to the king and cut him off. White could move to the side here and gain the diagonal opposition again, or he could even push forward or move to the side here and gain direct opposition, forcing black to step to the side, and then he could try and swing around and move forward. So this is just to show you examples of the direct opposition like this, the diagonal opposition, and we notice that there is an odd number of squares in between them each time. So one square, here one square. So now, if we have direct opposition and we put 3 squares, once again an odd number, whoever's turn it is to move, then he will have to give up ground. So let's say white moves here to D2, and there's an odd number of squares. He has the distant direct opposition because there's an odd number of squares in between. So if black, let me fix that, excuse me. So once again, an odd number of squares. White has just moved to D2. If black moves forward and white moves forward, we see that white has the opposition again. So we can go back all the way to the edge of the board like this. And now we see there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares in between them. So whoever's turn it is to move here will grab the opposition. If white moves forward, now there's an opposite number of squares in between the 2 kings. So white has grabbed the opposition because he's moved to a square that has an odd number of squares in between the kings in a straight line here. So if black moves forward, white moves forward, and they just continue, and white ends up with the opposition with 1 square in between. And the same diagonally as well, so I'll show you that. Here, once again, we have 6 squares in between. So this time, if it's black's turn to move, and they just move towards each other, taking turns, well, now black has the opposition because of that odd number of squares in between. So the diagonal opposition, the direct opposition, and then when there are more squares in between, we have the distant direct opposition and the distant diagonal opposition. So the key with opposition is just if white is here and he moves up to a square that leaves an odd number of squares in between the opponents, well then he will grab the opposition. So now the final thing to remember is, well, how do you grab the opposition if it's just random? Like say the white king is down here and the black king is over here, and it's white's turn to move. How can he ensure that he'll reach or obtain the opposition? Well, then there's another trick you can use where white will jump on a square that leaves a square between the kings where all the corners of that square are the same color, and it is the opponent's turn to move. So white will move here to B2. And so this makes a square or a rectangle between the kings from B2 to F2, up to the black king on F8, and then over to the B8 square. And we notice the corners of the square have the same color. So they're all dark squares. So now it's black's turn to move. Let's say he moves down here, and now the colors, the corners of the square are different. So white will try to once again move to a place where all the corners are the same, and it is his opponent's turn. So here we've created another square from F7 to B7 to B3 to F3. And if we notice, all the corners are the same. The kings are on light squares, and these other corners are light squares as well. So now black moves forward again, and let's say he moves here. Well, now white must find another square that will leave all dark squares in the corners of the square. So he would have to move here, and so now we have B6, B4, F4, and F6, all dark squares. So now if black moves towards white here, white can once again move to C4, creating a square with light colors, on each corner. But he's grabbed the direct diagonal opposition here. And so we could try that again just to show you one more time. Let's say the kings are not so far diagonal from each other. So if they're like this, and it's white's turn to move, he has to look here. What should he do? He could just grab the direct opposition by jumping here and leaving 5 squares in front of each other. And if black moves forward, then he can move forward. And now, we see it just continues on, and white would have the opposition. But if it's a little bit trickier because they're off to the side like this, once again, we'll see what white has to do. So he wants to move to a square where all the corners are the same color, so he would jump up here. If black moves towards the white king here to another dark square, white would move up, and once again the corners are all dark squares. And if black continues to move towards the white king, well, now white can move here and gain the direct opposition. All right, so I hope that gives you a little better grasp on how to achieve the opposition from different areas on the board, whether you're close to each other with your kings or the kings are all the way across the board. Now, of course, when you're figuring this out, things could change a little bit if there are pawns or other pieces on the board because they may block the travel of your kings. So keep that in mind. But let's take a look again at how we can use the power of the opposition to reach the key squares in different pawn endings. So if we look at a white pawn on the board here, now black has the opposition here and white is in front. So let's say it's white's turn to move, he would have the opposition. But if it's if it's black's turn to move here, then white has the opposition. So whenever there's an opposing one square in between the kings, whoever's turn it is to move is going to have to give ground. So let's say here it's black's turn to move. Well, he doesn't want to give ground, but white has the opposition, and so if black has to move, he would have to move out of the way, to the side. This would let white move forward. If he goes after the pawn, well, white could just march that pawn up. Black would have to try and cover these key squares up here where the pawn is trying to march up to and promote. But at this point, white can get up here and cover the key squares because all black could do is move here. And now, even if this would happen, and white doesn't control the key squares immediately by pushing that pawn, so instead of pushing the pawn, white should just go here and cover the key square of d8, and then the game would be over because that pawn would just march forward. But, well, let's see. I'll take a look at that. So if he goes up here, I mean, you have something like this that you have to watch out for because now the pawn is under threat. So white would have to go back and guard his pawn. So if he marches up, and now you push here, if black would try and cover the key square of d8 and d7, well, then white would just gain the opposition and force black to the side, and now white will cover these key squares that allow the pawn to promote. So if black moves, now the pawn is just marching forward and promoting. So instead of trying to memorize what all the key squares are, just remember that in order to promote the pawn, you have to control the squares in front of that pawn. And the best way to do that is to put your king in front of your pawn. So if we go back to this position, here it will be a case of whoever has the opposition. So if black has the opposition here and it's white's turn to move, white could step to the side and black will just take the opposition. So now if the pawn is pushed forward, well, now black can just get in front of the pawn. And what does white do? Now the pawn is blocking white's path to capture the opposition. So if the pawn is pushed forward, now we have the basic position where you just move back and grab the opposition like this. So every time the pawn moves forward, you can either jump directly in front of it or even back here like this, because if white tries to come forward, you just jump in front of the king, cutting off his ability to reach any of these key squares in front of the pawn. And we just have the same old position here. So block the pawn. Now what does white do? Move over and cover his pawn. You just jump straight back in front of the pawn. And if white tries to come over on this side, you just block him from reaching any key squares in front of the pawn. And then the game will just end up in a stalemate like this. All right. So there are a lot of things to remember about these end games like this. Here, let me move this with pawn and kings. One thing is that it makes a difference if the king is one square in front of his pawn, like this. Whoever has the opposition is going to have a huge advantage. But if we look at the difference between the king being two squares in front of his pawn, well, that can make a difference. So even if white has the opposition here, even if black has the opposition and white has to move, let's take a look at what happens here. So the pawn moves forward, and now white has the opposition. So black just steps to the side. White swings over here. And now what? If black tries to keep the opposition like this, white just moves forward. And now if black tries to cover the key queening square and the square leading up to it, well, now this pawn can just start marching forward. If black gains the opposition, the pawn can just move forward, forcing the king to move. Then white keeps the opposition. White keeps the opposition, and we'll have to give ground. So the key thing to remember is that you must try and gain control of the key squares in front of your pawn and leading all the way up to the key squares, the queening square. So we can take a look at some other examples here. How do you defend? Well, you want to try and keep the opposition here. If white tries to move, you just block him. If he pushes forward, now you just try and stay in front of that pawn. Once he does that, you just back straight away from the pawn. Then if the king comes up, you block him off, keeping this king from reaching these important key squares in front of the pawn. All right, so what happens if you don't do that? Well, let's take a look. So let's say this pawn is marched up to here, and you are here, and white has managed to jump in front of his pawn to a key square here, and the pawn is on the 5th rank. Well, even if black has the opposition and white must move, and black tries to keep the opposition, well, now the pawn can march forward here. And so if he jumps in front of the pawn, well, now there's a problem because this pawn can just march forward, squeezing the king out from covering these key squares. And we see that the pawn is cutting off, along with the king, many squares, allowing the king to move forward and cover the key square of d8, and the pawn will promote because the king can't stay up here and must move, and then we would have the pawn promoting to a queen. All right, well, I hope this helped all you beginners out there. With key squares and opposition, it can be difficult to get a grasp on it sometimes. But as a review, if you just remember, when the kings are directly in front of each other like this, whoever's turn it is to move, they will have to give ground. So if white was back here and it's his turn to move, and he jumps forward, leaving an odd number of squares in between the kings, and they're directly in line with each other, well, white has just grabbed the opposition, and black will have to either back up or move to the side, giving ground to white here. And also, you can have the diagonal direct opposition. So once again, one square, an odd number of squares in between the kings, and one side will have to give ground. So if white was here on f3 and moves up, grabbing the diagonal opposition, well, then black would have to give some concession. Now, if white makes the mistake of jumping over here, well, then black would be able to move to e6, and now black would have the opposition, and white would have to move to the side or back up. And then if you just remember, the distant diagonal or direct opposition is just when there are a larger number of odd squares in between the kings. So if we have a king here and a king here, and it's white's turn to move, white could just move forward, leaving an odd number of squares in between, and he'll end up with the opposition as they move closer together. The same diagonally as well. So here we have even number of squares if it's white's turn to move, and he moves, leaving an odd number of squares diagonally in between. Then as they move closer together, white will have the opposition. All right, and the one other thing with opposition to remember is when they're far apart and you want to grab the opposition, but you're not sure how to do it because they're not in line with each other. Well, just remember to create a square where all the corners are the same color, so white will move forward, leaving his opponent with the move, and it has a square with all the same colored corners here. So, black could move forward towards the king, and once again, white will move up, creating another square or rectangle with all the same colored corners. And then now, let's say instead of moving forward, black jumps over here. Well, now white can take the direct opposition here with an odd number of squares in between. So if black moves forward, white moves forward, and white retains the opposition here. All right, and as far as key squares go, just remember you're trying to get your king in front of your pawn, and you should be wary of pushing your pawn. If it's white's turn to move here, and he just pushes his pawn forward, so he's retained the opposition, and let's see what happens here. So this will be giving white an advantage because white has the opposition. So if black just backs up, white just keeps the opposition. If the king moves to the side, well then white can gain ground and move forward. If black goes after the pawn, well then you have to be careful to keep that pawn protected. So you'll have to move that pawn forward. And if black tries to move back up, well then you just move forward, taking the opposition from the side, but also controlling the key squares. But you have to watch out, because if black goes back after the pawn, you can't push that pawn forward or it'll be captured. So you have to protect the pawn. And now if he moves up, well, now you can just push forward. If black tries to jump up here and control the key squares, well, then white will just gain the opposition and be forced to move to the side. And then white will take control of the key squares, allowing this pawn to just march forward here and promote. All right, well, the video's gone on for quite a bit here, so I'll end it there. Just feel free to leave any comments or questions. Also, any recommendations on things you would like to see in the future, requests. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this video on the key squares and the opposition, and maybe I'll go more in depth on all of this in the future. So thank you all, and have a super chess day.